Hello, bonjour, and welcome back to your source for everything and anything public education in Canada. Je m'appelle Juliana Mako de l'équipe d'affaires publiques de la CTF FCE, and it's my pleasure to bring you this episode, which is a replay from the Women's Symposium panel discussion held on May 19th, 2023. Veuillez noter que cette session se déroule dans les deux langues officielles. It's now my pleasure to present the session on teaching and learning during the pandemic, lived experiences.
We're going to get started here with the first session of this final day. As you can tell, it's a panel focused on teaching and learning during the pandemic, lived experiences. While the phrase "we're all in this together" became somewhat commonplace in the pandemic, we were reminded we did not all experience the pandemic in the same way, not at all. It may have been the same storm. We were in very different boats. And I think it's important to remember that. So during this session, you will all have the chance to hear from panelists who are going to share their stories, perhaps with vulnerability, perhaps some tears, hopefully some aha moments, and lots of conversation among the panelists themselves and engaging all of you. This panel is intended to be a window on the worlds of three unique women, and also a glimpse into yours. The windows will open us a bit further to the experiences of teachers, of a mother, and of a student. So that just gives you a bit of a spoiler teaser for what's ahead. And with that, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our three panelists. And the first introduction will be in French because this is very much going to be une séance dans les deux langages. Alors, en premier, Nicole Beaulieu. Nicole a grandi à Rouyn-Noranda, au Québec. Elle est titulaire d'un baccalauréat en éducation de l'Université de l'Abitibi-Témiscamingue à Rouen et d'un baccalauréat d'art en psychologie de l'Université de Regina en Saskatchewan. Au cours de ces, et arrête tout le monde, 33 années de carrière, elle a eu le privilège d'enseigner à Iqaluit, en Nunavut, à Lac Charles, en Louisiane, à Ostrava, en République tchèque, et on enseigne actuellement, maintenant, dans une petite ville de l'Est d'Ottawa qui s'appelle Avonmore. Cet été, Nicole représentera la Fédération des enseignantes et des enseignants de l'élémentaire de l'Ontario, better known in this room as ETFO, dans Projet Outre-mer. Elle participera pour la 5e fois cet été comme chef d'équipe au Bénin, où elle va travailler avec les enseignantes et enseignants au Bénin. Et dernièrement, tout au long de sa carrière dans l'éducation, Nicole a défendu, fièrement je crois, la justice sociale, y compris l'égalité des sexes, tant au Canada qu'à l'étranger. Bienvenue et merci Nicole. Merci. And now you may start to see a pattern if you're wondering how we chose these three. You'll see a little pattern. Next, it's my pleasure, almost in the middle, to introduce another Nicole, Dr. Nicole Grant. Nicole is a mom of two. May I name your two? Jeremy and Alice, and a researcher and policy analyst at the Canadian Teachers Federation. Among much other work and significant work, Nicole has been co-researcher on several studies documenting teachers and education workers' experiences teaching and living during the pandemic, including CTF FCE's significant report, But at What Cost? Mais à quel prix? And I think you'll know why that title was chosen for that report. Because we were looking at the mental health and well-being of teachers and education workers during the pandemic. Nicole regularly collaborates with researchers from across the entirety of the CTF-FCA membership, including many of you in this room. And lastly, Nicole holds a doctorate from the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa, where she researched place-based knowledge production from anti-racist perspectives. Thank you, Nicole, and welcome.
Thank you, Cassie.
And last but not least, what a pleasure to be reunited with Nora, to my left here. Nora Afifi is a third-year student in International Development and Globalization at the University of Ottawa. However, she was born on the left coast, a little shout out for British Columbia, where she was born and raised in Victoria, BC, and she attended a French first language in a minority context K-12 school. Nora's academic work focuses on the intersections of climate change, human security, resource management, and the Sustainable Development Goals. I know Nora. Nicole knows Nora. Others in the room know Nora because we had the privilege of having Nora work with us at CTF-FCA as a co-op student from the University of Ottawa last summer, 2022, May through August, through the co-op program. So it is so good to see you again, Nora, and we look forward to the student perspective. Welcome et bonjour.
Thank you so much, Cassie.
With that, we're going to launch into our first question. En premier, nous avons toutes vécu la pandémie en tant qu'individus. Mais pouvez-vous nous parler de votre expérience en tant que mère, Nicole, comme enseignante, Nicole, et on va peut-être commencer avec toi, et comme étudiante, Nora. Donnez-nous une fenêtre sur votre monde pandémique. Merci.
Je pourrais parler pendant des heures et des heures, mais en fait, tout le monde a vécu une situation similaire en tant qu'enseignant ou enseignante. Ce que j'ai trouvé le plus difficile de ma carrière, c'est le manque de contact humain avec mes élèves et avec les enseignants. Moi, je crois que je suis enseignante, j'ai été capable de survivre toutes ces années-là pour mon travail d'équipe et avec mes collègues. Lorsque j'ai un problème, c'est certain qu'une de mes collègues ou un de mes collègues va pouvoir m'aider. Ce contact humain-là, il m'a manqué. Je savais aussi que j'avais des petits bouts de chou à l'école qui ne déjeunaient pas parce que les parents ne pouvaient pas leur donner le déjeuner qu'on leur offre à l'école. Il n'y avait pas de support, d'appui émotif, ni pour les aider à l'école, parce que maman ou papa devaient être sur l'ordinateur en train de travailler. La course humaine, autant j'étais à la maison, j'ai jamais couru autant. D'une journée à l'autre, mon conjoint et moi, on est partis Toronto, London, aller chercher nos deux filles à l'université parce que on ne voulait pas qu'elles soient malades. On revient à l'école et je devais commencer à enseigner en ligne. Sur une quarantaine d'enfants, j'avais 6 élèves en ligne. J'avais une petite cocotte à 3 maisons de chez moi. L'Internet était mauvais, mais je devais enseigner. Mais j'enseigne les enfants, j'enseigne pas les parents. Pourquoi que les parents étaient devant moi, me posant des questions? Plusieurs des parents ne savaient pas comment faire fonctionner le team meeting. Plusieurs parents me posaient des questions côté, mais là, qu'est-ce que je fais? Mon enfant ne veut pas arrêter de bouger. Mes élèves qui avaient les fesses en l'air, ou sans chandail, ça a été très difficile, mais par contre, j'ai des enfants qui se sont plus exprimés avec moi parce que j'avais seulement 6 élèves en ligne. Alors oui, ça a été difficile. On ne devait même pas prendre en considération qu'est-ce que vraiment les enfants prenaient parce que tous les enfants passaient d'un niveau à l'autre sans vraiment être évalués. Il n'était pas question que j'évalue un travail parce que je ne savais même pas qui l'avait fait.
Merci, Nicole. Quel niveau?
L'année dernière, on a vécu 3 ans.
Okay.
Alors, 3 niveaux différents.
Okay.
Puis cette année, j'enseigne seulement la 3e année.
Okay. Merci. Nicole?
Window into my world during the pandemic. In February 2020, I had my second daughter, Alice. So that was right before the world shut down. And my son, Jeremy, was going into senior kindergarten September 2019. So he was just starting his second year of schooling. Being in Ontario, his first year of schooling was disrupted because of labor relations, which happens. But you're not expecting your second year to also be disrupted from something entirely different. So it was a lot of missed hopes, I would say, as a mom. With my son, he was in the hospital for the first 3 months of his life. So we had a very different early childhood for him. And I was really hopeful with my daughter that would be different. I would get to do all the mom and baby yoga things or the community things, you know. I would get to have a longer time with my midwife. But a lot of those things changed and were disrupted. And so I found it was a lot of, okay, that's not going to happen. Okay, that's not going to happen. Okay, that's not going to happen. And for my son, for Jeremy, he also has autism, so struggled socially to begin with. And I was really going to school, and a fairly small school, really privileged that way. I was really hopeful he'd make a friend that year, 2020. And being online as a kid that struggles socially, that wasn't going to happen. He wasn't going to make a friend. Wasn't going to have that recess time to do that unofficially, or that time at the beginning of class where they just get to play. So there was a lot of sadness and readjusting my expectations as a mom on what I could do for my kids and how I could help them. But also, it was a moment where I got to, despite Nicole's kind of frustration with those parents being like, hello, in the Zoom meetings or the Google Meet classrooms, it was really a privilege to get to see his teachers a little bit more, interact with them, and how amazing they were and how much patience they had for those kids. Mine was the kid that was constantly moving around. And so it was amazing to see them work and to feel like I could see the window into their world, but I understand on the other side that that's frustrating as a professional.
Thank you, Nicole. And you were working.
Yes.
And completing your doctorate.
Yes.
Like, wow. Just before we go back to you, Nicole, let's maybe hear a little bit from Nora about her experience as a university student in the pandemic.
Yeah, so when the pandemic hit, I was a senior in high school. And so I already had one foot out the door. I already knew where I was going for university. And the main task for our teachers was to prepare us for the international baccalaureate exams that were supposed to be held in May. And because of that, they had managed to pretty much teach us everything that we needed to know by the time the pandemic happened. So we were mostly just revising things that we already learned. And I think for me, since we were, 16, 17, we all kind of knew what the pandemic was, and we were very aware, and we were even like cracking jokes about it all the way back in like December. And we were just like, oh gosh, could you imagine, like, this is a zombie apocalypse. We did not take it seriously. We thought it was a whole joke. But then it started inching closer and closer, and slowly we realized what was happening. And then they canceled our graduation trip to Guatemala. And, maybe as a sign of privilege, that was what we were most upset about. So by the time, I didn't really know that, I think it was March 11th, but I could be wrong. I didn't really know that last day right before spring break was going to be one of my last days in that building. I didn't know that it was going to be like one of the last times that I saw some of my teachers in person. I did luckily get to see a few of them later on, but I really didn't know. I thought it was going to be over in 2-3 weeks and we'd be back. And I thought it was going to dissipate during spring break. But I was so disengaged. And I think that was the thing that struck me the most as someone that was really engaged in school and like really loved school and like loved learning. Like for once in my life, I would just sit in front of the screen and I would completely zone out and I didn't care what my teachers were saying. And I remember, some of my teachers would have to message me and be like, hey, can you reach out to this student and see what's going on with them? And in my mind, I was like, I'm sorry, but he's never been engaged in class and he's sure not going to start now. If I can't pay attention, he's not going to. And so that was my experience and that was my purview during the pandemic.
Thank you, Nora. And correct me if I'm wrong, your first year of university would have been all virtual?
Yeah, so my first year of university was also completely virtual. I started university and all my classes were online, and it really took away from that experience of going to university and like doing all the things in your first year and like meeting all these different people from you. And till now, it's still really difficult to actually just engage with people because it was kind of like we all just locked in on a few people as soon as we started school. And we never really got that experience to just kind of run around and meet a bunch of different kinds of people from different programs. And so it takes a lot of effort to actually meet people now. And even now that we are on campus, like people are very secluded from one another. And it does continue. And even right now, I'm currently doing some summer courses and they're all virtual. They're still all virtual. I did have a fully in-person semester in fall 2022, but that was the only time that I wasn't doing hybrid or completely virtual learning since March 2020.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked. And for what it's worth, my 17-year-old 12th grade daughter would share your observations about how human interaction has changed. We didn't delve into some of the other things that I do want to acknowledge many of us experienced in the pandemic, including illness ourselves, illness of loved ones, loss of loved ones, financial precarity, mental health challenges, and stress. We could go on and on. La pandémie a mis en lumière certaines inégalités cachées dans le système de l'éducation publique. Avez-vous, vous trois, quelque chose en particulier qui n'était peut-être pas aussi évident avant la pandémie? Nicole.
J'ai trouvé ça très intéressant, Nicole. Qu'est-ce que tu as soulevé en étant parent et tu parlais à l'enseignant? Parce que je comprends pourquoi tu le faisais et que les parents le faisaient. Mm-hmm. Ce qui me frustre dans la situation, c'est lorsqu'on écoutait la télévision et qu'on voyait la publicité ou qu'on entendait notre cher ministre de l'Éducation en Ontario, qui n'a pas d'enfants et qui n'a pas été éduqué dans le secteur public, juste en le disant. On voyait la publicité, les élèves distancés à 2 mètres, tous avec un ordinateur. Mm-hmm. Ce que je n'ai pas été formée, c'était pour former les parents en ligne d'un jour à l'autre, les parents pour les mathématiques, pour la géographie. Je comprends pour les parents. Je saisis le besoin que les parents avaient. Mais c'était frustrant de voir la publicité. Et mon conseil scolaire disait, c'est la seule façon de le faire, hybride ou en ligne, et que les parents sont prêts, tout le monde a des ordinateurs, ce qui est complètement faux, que les parents devaient avoir l'Internet, mais ils devaient payer pour l'Internet, illimité, parce que tout le monde était en ligne. Alors, la réalité qui a été projetée, déjà que les enseignants ont sorti des négociations, déjà que certains parents avaient de la difficulté avec nous autres, que tout d'un coup, l'image qui est projetée, c'est que tout va bien avec l'enseignement en ligne, ce qui était complètement faux. Mm-hmm. Complètement faux. Et tu es une personne très éduquée. Et tu étais en congé parental. Il y a des parents, il y a des enseignants qui enseignaient, mm-hmm. qui étaient devant leurs enfants, devant leurs élèves. Oups, mais leur coco avait de la difficulté, des besoins spéciaux. Mais c'était pas projeté à la télévision, ça, ou parlé à la radio. Mais nous, on le savait. Puis on pouvait pas se plaindre, parce qu'on était privilégiés. Mon conjoint était dans le syndicat, on avait nos 2 salaires, on avait notre maison, on pouvait sortir, aller chercher un café au Tim en auto, parce qu'on n'avait pas de danger. On avait cette liberté-là. Je ne pouvais pas me plaindre, mais le stress et voir les parents stressés, c'était incroyable. C'est la publicité, l'image qui a été projetée qui était fausse de notre réalité, de ma réalité.
No, merci, Nicole. And I'm wondering how much of that reality was there for all of us, from coast to coast to coast, across the 3 territories, in every province, in many communities, pre-pandemic, but the pandemic exposed more clearly despite the media, but for some families. So I don't know, Nicole, Nora, if you'd like to comment on that.
I guess one thing that, I noticed is that I was an only child living with a single mother, but I was also 17, so I could easily log on. I already knew how to use Teams, I already knew how to use Zoom, and I could just log on, and I'd always been a good student, so my parents didn't really supervise me that much, but they probably should have done it a bit more. Luckily, they aren't here today, so they don't need to know that. But
Stays in this room, Nora.
it does stay in this room. But like a lot of my friends had like several younger siblings, and I have a surprising amount of friends whose parents work in the medical field. So their parents were working overtime all the time, and they were, they would be in class with us, but at the same time, they have their 5-year-old brother in the chair next to them, and they're trying to get him to pay attention to his classes, and they can't pay attention in theirs. And I had one friend, she lived in a rural area, and there were just like too many computers on in the house at one time, so her internet was just not working. And I felt really lucky that my biggest problem was just that they had a couple fire drills in my apartment building. I had to run out in the middle of class. I felt pretty lucky because I had a lot of friends that just like genuinely were pretty much parenting their own siblings while also trying to learn. And so I found that to be very striking to me. And I guess also to a certain extent, just the fact that there were some parents that just really were not even there just to listen to their kids. And it's not so much their fault, but just the reality that there were some parents that just were not paying attention when their children were struggling. And so there was a lot of kind of camaraderie among us as kids, pretty much, like just trying to be there for one another, but we don't know how to be there for each other, So it was really difficult just to see that not everyone had the same support system. And I felt like that was really something that struck me really hard. And just, trying to be there for your friends, but it's hard when you can't. It's a lot easier when you're there in person and you can actually sit there with them and help them out. But when you're at a distance, it's practically impossible.
Thank you, and that's a good segue to a parent perspective, maybe. Nicole.
Yeah, the thing that when you're talking, but when I was listening to both of you, a quote from actually a participant from the Ottawa cost report came back to me. They were talking about, they were a kindergarten teacher and they were asked to use Google Classroom. And they were like, how do I teach kindergartners to use a platform that is text-based? They can't read. Luckily, my son didn't have to use Google Classroom, and he was a privilege that he can read at that time, but most kids couldn't. So I did see a lot of those moments where there would be a kid who didn't know how to turn on and off their mic, didn't know how to turn off and on their screen, and there was nothing the teacher, or even as a parent watching from the outside, that we could do. We just had to watch this kid struggle by themselves or just disengage altogether. So I was definitely in a privileged position, especially at the beginning of the pandemic during my maternity leave, that I was able to be there to be right beside Jeremy a lot of the time. And so was Alice. So she got to meet a lot of her older brother's classmates, and sometimes she was more engaged than he was. But as I was working, I definitely was that mom that had my laptop right beside and my son at the kitchen table, and I'd have to be leaning over every once in a while. What are you doing? Or Jeremy, come back here. We're not at body break yet, which was basically YouTube videos of dancing and singing, which made sense. So the whole family got to participate in that because that was our way of getting Jeremy to participate at all. So I got to do lots of body break things, but it definitely showed you just how much it's so important to have that physical interaction, and how we seemingly rely on technologies to make us more connected. But this was a moment where it really showed us that it doesn't always work, that this is not the place for technology to connect us.
Thanks for that. And I do want to acknowledge that in many communities in Canada, there just wasn't even the option of virtual learning. I know many colleagues in Nunavut who were making physical learning packs and figuring out safe at a distant ways for those learning packs to be delivered and received. So again, the experiences are quite different, but I do think it shone a spotlight on many of the realities of Canadian families, be it single parent, shift working, families that live in poverty. So without school, there isn't the access to the food program. et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to move on. I know some questions were shared with you previously. We're going to shift the order just a little bit. Nicole Grant has referenced a bit of the CTF-FCO research during the pandemic, and so much of what's already been shared, I think, reminds us of what a challenging time this was, and therefore the need to focus on the impact on mental health and well-being, and something we don't always talk openly enough about. We're maybe getting a little better at it, I hope, because it is so important. Mental health is health. So I'd love to hear from any of you in any particular order what you observed or experienced in yourself, your colleagues, peers, students, regarding the impact on mental health and well-being during the pandemic, and perhaps as we start to come out of it. Any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Sure, I guess I can speak first. It was interesting in my position as a researcher for CTF-FCO, and I worked with Dr. Pamela Rogers, who I'm sure many of you know, doing qualitative interviews with 32 amazing women and men who were teaching during the pandemic. And that was during the winter of 2021. So many were still online, many were still in very precarious situations that were constantly changing. And listening to their stories as I sat in my bedroom with my laptop, so it was the only quiet place I could find away from my daughter and my son, it was a moment of, after Pam and I would have interviews, we would have to call each other and have a debrief, because it was the only way to process through what we were listening to and taking on those stories. And I don't say that it was a burden, because it was an amazing experience to listen to these stories of these 32 educators. But it was difficult to what do we do with that now? How do I process that they're so lonely and so frustrated? I can't do anything besides share their stories, which is in part why the Bach report ended up being so long, because we wanted to really privilege all those stories as much as we could, because we felt we couldn't take their stories and belittle them or put them together and make something else. They needed to be as complex as possible. And I think that the frustration and the loneliness, and I think what you talked about, Nichole, about the disjunction between what the media portrayed and what was real in your world, was so accurate to what I heard as well. So there was that level of just, how do we all process this immense amount of emotion when we're all so distanced from each other? We're all so still scared. We're all still actively living through something that is on the cusp of constantly changing. And I think that was part of it. Mm-hmm. That I think for me, long term, my mentality has changed, that as a parent, I find for many of us that we have a projection for our kids and for ourselves and for our life, where we're going to go, what our next thing is. Even if it's, I'm going to sign my kid up for summer camp this year. For the last couple years, haven't even thought about doing it, because it was one of those things where, what if this gets canceled again? If I set this up for my son and I get this in his routine and he is prepared to do this and I have to tell him it's not happening, that's a lot for him to process. And I don't want to let him down. So it was a lot of a shift of mentality that I feel like I'm still getting over. I still don't have a strong future focus right now. I'm still in recovery that way, in the sense of feeling like I'm still living a little bit close in time, and I don't make future plans too long, because we've all been let down by them.
Yeah. Autre pensée, quelque chose à partager?
La pandémie, elle a commencé à notre semaine de relâche au mois de mars 2020. Oui. On était en ligne. Là, le gros problème, l'impact, je crois, qui a été le plus difficile à prendre, c'est lorsque on est retourné à l'école en septembre 2020. Moi, je viens de Upper Canada, District School Board, et on devait enseigner sur les 4 paliers. J'avais des élèves en ligne, j'avais des élèves devant moi. Je devais préparer les fameux paquets de feuilles pour les enfants qui ne venaient pas du tout en ligne. Et je devais aussi préparer le matériel que j'enseignais à mes élèves en ligne, mais les enfants en ligne devaient avoir accès au papier. On devait faire les 4. Lorsque le mois d'octobre est arrivé, les enseignants et les enseignantes, on était crevés. Et tout le monde connaît le mois de septembre, octobre dans les écoles. On est déjà débordés. On était épuisés. On avait l'impression qu'on était déjà à la fin de l'année scolaire. Et on n'arrêtait pas de se faire demander et demander et demander. Et il y avait des enseignants entre nous qui chiolaient, qui disaient « Oh là là, les enseignants et les enseignantes qui travaillent à la maison, qui préparent ces fameux paquets de feuilles du conseil scolaire, ils font la belle vie. Ils sont pas devant les élèves. » Puis, on avait 2 enseignantes, nous, à l'école. C'est ça qu'elles faisaient pour santé physique. Elles ne pouvaient pas être à l'école. Puis, lorsque, Bev, tu m'as approché, moi, j'ai approché mes enseignants à l'école. J'aurais demandé, est-ce que vous avez des choses à dire? Ah, bien là, Nicole, on a des affaires à dire. Mais elle m'a dit, Nicole, on était tellement exclus des enseignants parce qu'on était à la maison. Et les gens pensaient qu'on foutait rien, mais c'est pas vrai. Il y avait tellement d'exigences, d'attentes envers eux, puis ils étaient isolés. Alors, l'isolement que ceux qui préparaient pour le conseil scolaire a été épouvantable. Leur santé mentale dégringolée. Et nous, à l'école, on essayait seulement de... Comme les phoques, tu sais, ils sont dans l'eau, puis ils doivent respirer. Je me sentais comme un phoque.
Ouais.
Sur la banquette.
P-H-O-K-U-E.
Oui,
Mais pour être sérieuse encore pour au moins une minute, et je ne parle pas pour toi, Nora, mais je crois que ce sentiment de l'isolation qui était la réalité pour la plupart parmi nous, des enseignantes en salle de classe, des présidentes au syndicat, des travailleurs au syndicat, etc. Je crois que tu as mentionné aussi ce sentiment, cette expérience comme étudiante d'être isolée. Aimerais-tu partager un peu plus de l'impact pour la santé mentale des étudiantes et étudiants?
Why? So I'm an introvert, so the first month of the pandemic, it was a vibe. I just enjoyed myself so much. And I was like, great, I don't have to see anyone. You mean I have a reason to just stay home alone? This is great. Everyone's doing the same thing. But eventually it gets to that point where it's touching on what Nicole was talking about with like kind of the projection aspect, where it's just, I expected a big graduation and I expected it to be like every other class prior to mine's graduation, and I expected to do this international trip just like every class before mine had, and it was just, and like we had all these plans and we thought we knew exactly what our last semester of school was going to be like, and it just got completely tossed in the trash. And I remember for me personally, just being someone that's very like type A and that needed structure and all of that, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna stop caring about everything because I can't care, because then I get disappointed. And I feel like to this day, that's still something that I have to deal with, where, for example, like at my job and in school, I'm very much just in the mindset of, I'm taking this one day at a time, and I don't have a big grand master plan for anything. And when I was in high school, I had a 5-year plan. That's gone in the trash. It doesn't matter anymore. And I can't really project myself in the future. And I think that was something that for a lot of us, we all experienced that. And it just felt like whatever you did wasn't really happening. And I remember before we actually came up here, me and Nicole Grant, we were actually talking about, and Kazu was there too, and we were talking about how it was kind of like a time warp, and how it was almost like an amnesia response, and it was like we had to actually think about what happened, because we just tried to forget about it as soon as we could. And I feel like that was very symptomatic of just not being able to like fully care about anything, because when you did, it got really disappointing all of a sudden. So.
Thanks, Nora, and I see Nicole's going to jump in. Nicole.
Je veux juste faire un lien avec Nora et Nicole en parlant des attentes. En tant qu'enseignant, lorsqu'on planifie notre enseignement, on pense toujours aux attentes.
Oui.
Nos buts, nos objectifs d'apprentissage. Oui, tout le monde?
Oui.
Our goals are to...
Oui.
Mais lorsqu'on était en pandémie, mes attentes étaient tellement restreintes à mon activité que j'envoyais à la maison. Je pouvais même pas dans ma tête dire, est-ce que mes élèves apprennent? Parce qu'il n'y avait aucune façon pour que je puisse leur parler pour voir c'était quoi leur apprentissage. Parce qu'à tous les jours, je lis avec mes élèves, je parle à mes élèves, je vois comment sont leurs émotions. Mais durant la pandémie, je ne pouvais pas les suivre dans leur apprentissage et dans leur croissance. C'est ça qui est difficile parce que on est tellement conditionnés, les enseignants. La première chose qu'on fait, quel est notre objectif d'enseignement, d'apprentissage? Ça, là, pendant 1 an et demi, ça a été mis de côté. Mais on continue à faire avancer les élèves.
Oui.
Puis il y en a qui n'ont pas vraiment avancé pour n'importe quelle raison, qui sont des bonnes raisons.
Mais toujours stressante parce que on n'était pas capable de savoir vraiment comment vont les élèves. Et c'était pareil for me as an executive director, work very closely with our staff team, not really knowing how are people faring, you know, and especially respecting the right of some to keep a camera off, for example, but then not seeing someone. Wow, c'était difficile. Nicole Grant's going to touch in like an elevator moment on a project of the CTF-FCA aimed at helping address teacher and education worker mental health and well-being. It's just a start, but I think it's important for folks here to know. So Nicole.
Thank you. So out of the But at What Cost report, we knew at CTF-FCA that we had to do a follow-up, that we couldn't just take all these stories and publish them and leave it there, that we had to do some action. And luckily, we were approached by the Public Health Agency of Canada with some potential funding to do a pilot project of interventions in schools. So CTF-FCA has recently procured that funding, and we are doing 3 pilot projects in schools that are during class time with release time that's going to be paid to all those teacher participants so that they can engage in 5 interventions on various mental health topics. That allows them the time during their school day with additional time to plan afterwards, so we're not taking time away that they have to make up, and that they will work together in those interventions in those schools so we can actually see if that's going to help them with their social emotional learning and ability to work together as colleagues again. So we look forward to being able to share that as we move forward. We're just starting working with our pilot schools in Newfoundland and Labrador actually, and in Alberta and in Manitoba. So thank you so much for that, and we're really excited to be able to share that.
Thank you. As we wrap up with never enough time when we have over 150 amazing women gathered together, I'm going to invite each of the panelists to share a final word or two, any reflections, perspective on the pandemic as enseignantes, parents, recherchistes, étudiantes. Les derniers mots sont à vous, mais désolée, assez bref. Nicole.
J'aimerais juste passer un commentaire pour la santé mentale des enseignants et des enfants. On le sait tous qu'on a été affectés, mais nos attentes vis-à-vis nos élèves, les attentes gouvernementales, du ministère, sont toutes là. L'Ontario, on a l'OCRE, des ETFO, ils arrivent, tous les enseignants. On veut prendre le temps d'écouter, d'aider les enfants, mais il n'y a pas de temps. Parce qu'il y a la pression d'enseigner les maths, les langues. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On s'occupe de nous autres ou on s'occupe de l'académie?
Merci, ma chère. Nicole?
Oh, gosh, I would say that it's reminded me that I have a responsibility as a parent, not just to my kids, but to the education system that they're part of, and seeing teachers and listening to their experiences as a researcher, but also seeing them engage the teachers that my son had. I can't imagine. I know what I've gone through. I know how it has affected all of us, but I think that we have a responsibility to lift up teachers more than we have already. I think that As a parent of a son who does require extra support and extra help, I can't say enough how much that means to me as a parent, and that it is my responsibility to all of you as educators to continue to lift your voices. And that's become even more apparent to me and meaningful to me as I've engaged in the pandemic. So thank you, all of you, for all that you do. And I will do what I can to lift up your voices from my position and as a parent. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Nora.
Yeah, I'll share two quick thoughts, one as a former high school student and one as an international development student now. My first thought as a high school student was that even prior to the pandemic, my teachers were burnt out, and it showed and it reflected on us because our mental health suffered when our teachers' mental health suffered. And that's something that I hope you consider, that taking care of yourself is also a way of taking care of your students. And the second point is just that a lot of what we see in the teaching profession here in Canada is very much something that is replicated in all different sectors in Canada and abroad. And that I think that's why national, international, regional solidarity is incredibly important.
Les mots me manquent pour dire des remerciements assez à vous trois. Sincerely, what a privilege for me to share a stage with each of you, to learn with you, to reflect with you. I have about 5,000 more questions. Don't worry, I won't ask them now, but sincerely, on behalf of all of us, my heart is full. I am just so grateful for all that you shared of yourselves. And I think you've given us some hope in a time when it's been hard to have hope, and some important advocacy messages for all of us to carry forward. So could we all give these three an incredible round of applause?
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a beat. Thank you for listening and tuning in to Your Source.